This is the beginning of podcast 2 for Chapter 7, which is about teaching during activity. The primary cause of off-task behavior is that the task is inappropriate either because of the content or the organization. On this slide we have some ideas that will help you maintain student interest. Provide feedback to students on the performance and refine the task. Providing feedback helps to focus the students on the task and helps them to refine the task, in other words, improve the quality of the task. Provide a break from practice and then resume practice. Or take a time out and explain to the whole class a reteaching exercise. Reorganize practice so students are practicing the same task in a slightly different way than they did before. Or extend the task in a lateral way. There's no increase in difficulty or a different way. It's a different way to practice the same thing. In other words, if you were having a volleyball set between partners, you could change the task to volleyball setting into a basketball goal. It wouldn't change the task, but it would change the environment in which it's being practiced. Task pacing is an extremely important uh, concept that we need to talk about during this slide. That is the amount of time the teachers give the students to practice before moving to the next task. Again, task pacing has a lot to do with 80% of the class being successful. When you can observe that and scan the room and see that 80% of the students get the task, then it's probably time to move on. The observation and analysis of student responses is an essential skill for teachers. It's an essential skill for beginning teachers to practice and develop. The positioning of the teacher is very important to be able to view the whole group. We talk about back to the wall all the time, but you do need to make sure you can see the group and always change positions as many times as you possibly can. One of the problems that we have in teacher positioning is that people stay at a home base position, or teachers stay at a home base position, and they don't move around the class. You need to know what to look for and identify those critical elements in advance. That's why we ask you to put, when you put teacher observation as an assessment in the assessment column, we ask you to list the critical elements that you'll be looking for. Not a whole listing of 8 different mechanical parts, but the 1 to 3 critical elements of that skill that you want to focus on. Then you also need to determine a plan or strategy for observing large groups and individuals. Are you going to go around the class and try to look at 2 to 3 students at a time and keep moving? Or do you look at half of the class and try to see what the other class is doing later on? You have to come up with a plan for how you're going to do that. Teachers develop skill in observing because of the knowledge of the content that they're teaching, the context of the class, whom you are teaching, and the content you're observing. All of those things are dependent upon the observation skills that you develop. As part of safety and to try to avoid legal liability, teachers should always observe the entire group as much as possible, even when trying to help individual students. Move so that you can visit all students at the same time, so that, or in the same period during the class. Try not to get caught in the center of the class for very long. Don't make a home base position on the courts or the gym floor or whatever. Try to move around to get to all of the students and give them feedback. As an example, sometimes physical education teachers, when they're teaching tennis, like to stay at the net posts of the tennis courts in between courts. That means that the people who are behind you and you have your back to them, that means that they could start disrupting or misbehaving or not focusing on the task that you've asked them to do. So it's important to go around the outside of the tennis courts and behind all the people that are practicing. Teacher feedback for students is very important. Teacher feedback maintains the student focus on the learning task, and it serves to motivate and monitor student responses. Feedback should provide information to help the student improve performance, but we don't want to overwhelm them with too much feedback. We want to pick out the things that are the most critical that they need to work on and that we have taught for that day. You want to try to maintain the student focus on the task. Feedback motivates students. It also serves to monitor student responses for the teacher. Most feedback occurs during or immediately after the skill is performed. And most of the time, teachers will watch a student perform the skill several trials before they give them feedback, because you want to see if they are consistently doing the same thing. There are limitations to teachers' feedback. In large group instruction, feedback is a real problem, even though we'd like to not admit it sometimes. It is necessary to give feedback when a learner cannot get feedback on limb position, cannot read the environment of what to do, or if they can't interpret the results of the movement. The results of the movement are known as knowledge of results, and that means that when a tennis player hits the ball off to the right, most of the time that gives them some feedback automatically without the teacher knowing that they hit the ball a little bit late, or they hit it with their follow through that particular direction. So sometimes the knowledge of the results of the skill gives them some feedback without the teacher. In those cases, feedback is not necessary when the skill itself kind of provides the feedback, or when the learner has a very clear idea of what to do. If the ball for a forearm pass keeps going into the net, then the learner knows that they need to get their hips below the ball and get some lift or arc on the ball so that the setter can get underneath it. However, as teachers, we want to avoid what we call the shotgun approach, asking learners to focus on a task. Then the teachers have a tendency to give feedback on everything he or she knows about the skill. You need to narrow the number of critical elements or cues and keep the feedback related to those 1 to 3 cues or critical elements that you focused on for the lesson. Feedback is useful when the errors the students are making are consistent. That's why you need to watch several trials of students to make sure that the errors are consistent so that you can give them appropriate feedback. The teacher has observed long enough to know what the student is doing, related to the first part. The teacher picks out what is critical for that student at that time. You're focusing on 1 to 3 critical elements, and usually that student is having trouble with that particular error. The teacher stays with the student long enough to make sure that any suggestions are used by the student. That's usually the thing that beginning teachers forget to do, is stay with the student after they've given them the feedback to make sure that they're applying the feedback that you've given to them. And when you actually see a student get better and apply what you've told them and the advice you've told them and the feedback you've told them, it's worth all the money in the world. That's the end of podcast 2 for chapter 7.